Hello, this is Teresa Thompson, and this is my husband, Terry Thompson, and we're the administrators to Just Ministry, and we're doing a study that is called Changes That Heal from Dr. Henry Cloud. We're working under the workbook and the book. We told people that you're welcome to just even get the workbook because we deliver a lot of what's in the book already. We have many of these things that we're studying posted in our files. So if you want to go back and kind of look at what we've already done and what we've already studied, it's available to you. Plus we're doing these Facebook Lives and we have those posted in the featured. So welcome everybody. I'd like to do an opening prayer real quick. Lord Jesus, thank you for an opportunity for us to come together in your name, that we be able to study different things that enrich our spiritual walk with you. We ask you to bring the Spirit into this meeting, that he speaks through us and that he touches the hearts of those that are receiving it. And Lord, we thank you for all that you're doing in Jesus' name. Tonight, we're going into lesson 4, when we fail to bond. We're in section 2, bonding with others, but we have to recognize when we fail to bond. One of the things that we're doing in this study is, in this part of the study anyway, is we're owning and identifying the things that are the good, bad, and the ugly, or I'd like to even make that even better, the good, the great, the not so great kind of things we go through in our everyday life, and all the damage that the enemy has done in our lives, whether it's been something that we've been injured by from others or our own sin, but all the havoc that he's played in our life, and then what the result of that is. So tonight, we'll be doing case studies from the book, and we will also be doing like these, it's like a little bit of a test. So have your journals ready, because this is really like a test on you. Everything about you, the person you are, what has been the outcome of everything you've lived through in your life. You know, all the things that, what God's done in it, and all the things that Satan's done in it, and all the things that you've done in it. Let's see the results of what happened to your life, and maybe some of the things that you're struggling with will come to light. And then in that, we learn from other chapters, we bring, because tonight will be our truth, we'll bring grace into that, which is cultivating around it, and bringing loving relationships around it, and being vulnerable with the things that we're struggling with, and then giving God the time to transform it. So there's going to be a lot of wonderful things that happen on the other side of this study as we go forward, but we need to identify some really deep issues tonight. So have your journals ready and leave a portion on the margin open, because we're going to go back and star some things after this study. Okay, so let's get started on this identification process. So first I'm going to give it a little bit of an introduction, because people most likely that won't make emotional bonds with one another are like in this perpetual state of hunger. They just, their hearts are crying for some kind of bonded relationship in their souls. But they generally go through 3 stages, and I'm going to start with the first one. It's protest. Whenever you have something happen in your life, you're going to protest it with some kind of anger or sadness. And if you doubt this, kind of look at on a lonely child or abandoned lover. You kind of go into this protest of what's happening around you. In Matthew 5:6, it says, Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount, it said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied." When a lonely or isolated person feels hunger, it's a good indicator that they need God and other people in their lives at that point. So kind of remember that the first stage is protest. The second one is depression and despair. When you have, when you decide that you're not going to God and you're not going to others, that protest is going to turn into depression and despair. It's like a plant without water. It starts to wither. And so that's when you see people, and even yourself, getting this hopeless feeling, and your eyes don't sparkle anymore. Your shoulders start to slump. You look tired. You look sad. And people might even make comments about that. But this is still actually a pretty good state to be in, believe it or not, because it's a push from God. You need to come into a relationship with me right now and some bonding people around you right now to help you and love you through this situation. In Proverbs 13:12, it says, hope deferred makes the heart sick. So it really does get sick in your heart when you're not going to people and God and keeping your hope alive. So even though you've gone through those next stages, those two stages, and you still decide you don't want to attach to God and others, this is where detachment comes in. That's the next term, detachment. And this is where you no longer even want people around and you don't want God around. You really become a very, very isolated person, and to the point of feeling dead inside. We have a case study on this. It's called The Cutter.
Dr. Cloud had a client that felt compelled to cut herself. She described her detachment this way: if I can't feel my pain, I start to feel dead inside. That's why I have to cut myself, in order to know that I can still feel something. Now, this self-destructive behavior may sound extreme, but it is really a move towards staying alive. She wanted to know that she was at least physically alive because she felt emotionally dead. She was detached. It's important to note that this detachment can also take on more socially acceptable forms. Take, for example, successful business people who work long hours and drive themselves to achieve. They may get awards and command large salaries at work, but their spouses and children often tell a different story.
Okay, so we got a little bit of a question for you on that. Have you ever gone through any of these stages that I just described: protest, depression, despair, and detachment? And if you're saying, no, I've never done that, that's lies, because I think we all tend to isolate ourselves at some point or another, at least to some degree or another. But I would like you to journal right now if you're currently living in any of those stages. Please journal that. Right now, for me, I'm not living in any of those stages, but that doesn't mean that won't change tomorrow. That's just the way those stages kind of work in our lives. So we're going to start this next exercise so we can identify the exact things that are holding us back from a healthier, happier life. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the term, I'm going to describe the term, and then I want you to, on a scale from 0 to 100, grade yourself on where you stand in that. After I describe it, it's going to, especially the descriptions he gives, are, like I can say, I'm 50% of the time this way, I'm 100% of the time this way, or I'm 0% of the time. And if you could just grade yourself as we go, you can even hit, other numbers, 75, 25, whatever works for your particular situation. And this is not what other people think of you. This is kind of how you grade yourself in these areas. Number 1, the first one is depression. This symptom may make you feel like you have a blackness inside. It's usually marked with intense sadness, inactivity, and difficulty with focusing on thinking or concentration, a significant increase or decrease in appetite or time spent sleeping, feelings of hopelessness, maybe even suicidal thoughts. A depressed person is repressing their feelings of sadness and anger due to lack of love. Often they will withdraw from social activities because even though they're craving attachments, social events generally don't satisfy that deeper need for bonding. Grade yourself now. The next one, which, by the way, you are posting these in the comments too, right? Okay, just making sure. So that way you can write them if you miss it when I say it. Number 2 is feelings of meaninglessness. A person with this feels like they have no meaning in their life. They may feel as though they have no purpose. They may desperately try to find other things to bring meaning in their lives, like activities or even ministry. But generally, these attempts push them further into isolation because their real craving is love. This feeling may rise up in people after they've lost a relationship and have not yet replaced it. They are not only grieving, but they are in deep isolation by cutting themselves off from other people. Most don't even realize it's a lack of bonding when they have this. Maybe they don't want to share their grieving at that point, but it is a lack of bonding that makes it even more intense. So grade yourself now on that. Number 3, feelings of badness and guilt. I graded high on this one, guys. To understand this symptom, we have to recognize that our brains compute lonely, isolated self as a bad self. But in reality, we aren't bad, we just think we are. Lonely people feel bad or guilty or unloved. They might say things like, I feel lonely, therefore I am not loved. And if I'm not loved, it must be because I'm unlovable or bad, or someone would love me. When we're feeling this crummy about ourselves, as we often do when we're lonely, we may feel as though we're bad. And the mind will then start to try to identify everything that's wrong with us. Then we'll try to find like all the different things that make us feel guilty. And then we'll even go to the extremes of doing maybe every religious thing we can do to kind of satisfy maybe a broken relationship with God, with maybe if it's confession with other people or forgiveness with other people or with God. And so we start just trying all these things, but the root of this problem is not necessarily sin, it's loneliness and isolation. Number 4, addiction. Okay, I still struggle with my own. The author calls addiction a compulsive psychological need for something. In other words, something someone thinks they need to survive. People are usually addicted to a specific substance like alcohol, drugs, or overindulgence in eating and food. But it can be other activities such as sex, gambling, work, destructive relationships, religion, achievement, and materialism. These substances rarely satisfy because they don't deal with the real problem. So curing addictions requires a return to sensitivity and humility. That means we're going to have to look at our feelings, and we're going to have to let go of the ego and let go of the pride, because addicted people have to admit to themselves that they're powerless when it comes to needing a relationship with God and others. Addictions are not the actual real desire. It's just a substitute for another need in our real self. It may take some effort, but the work involved is finding out what the real need is behind the addiction. Most commonly, it's a lack of attachment to others. And here's where Satan comes in. He somehow convinces us that our addictions are the very thing that we need, and we need to wrap our whole life around that addiction. But the one thing he's trying to do, really, is to keep our hearts from having those loving feelings and connections with God and others. His goal is just to isolate us in those addictions. So when the inner hunger is filled up with love, though, the driving force behind the addiction goes away. But we have a case study to talk about the lady with the food addiction.
I call this one the binge eater. One woman struggling with food addiction put it this way. I remember the first time I chose to call someone instead of eat. I could feel a strong pull towards the refrigerator, but I interpreted that as a pull towards love. So I called somebody in my group. After going over to their house and getting some real affection, some warmth, I wasn't hungry anymore. Since that time, I've learned to do that more and more. I'm finding out it's not really food I want in those times, it's love.
Okay. So there you go. Grade yourself on that one. Okay, number 5, distorted thinking. Emotional isolation will eventually shut us off from people, where we become angry and sad and depressed inside. And then if it goes unchecked, it can drastically start to distort our thinking. Our circuits start to overload and we become paranoid. And paranoia is a mental disorder that causes people to have irrational suspicion and distrust of others. They may feel like they are being attacked by inner pain that they just project towards other people. For instance, they may start to fear that others are trying to hurt them or they can't be trusted. Therefore, they avoid other people and isolate themselves even more. They come up with all sorts of delusions and obsessions for their internal pain. They have to make sense of that and internal pain, and they reflect that out from the inside out. We can't expect a paranoid person, by the way, to get better all on their own, because isolation produced the paranoia to begin with. They need people for interaction desperately. Then when the internal world begins to change with communication with others, their perception of the outside then world becomes better. I mean, even in this situation, paranoia can come in very different levels. If you have a lot of conspiracy theories in your heart about what people are, and you tend to clump them all together as all being bad, that might be a starting point of where paranoia is starting to set in. Number 6, emptiness. People who are disconnected with God and others feel empty. And emptiness is one of the most painful emotions a human being can feel. People don't feel their need for love, and they don't understand the love of others. They don't feel it. They generally think that others should be able to fill them up, but that's impossible. Someone can love them perfectly, but unless they feel the need for love and respond to it, they will feel empty. This type of person must accept and respond to others' expressions of love, whether it's perfect expressions or not. But first, they must recognize their own need for love. Then they go to God. God can fill them up with his love, and then they can go to others and begin the process of bonding, and then that emptiness will begin to fill itself up. They must recognize they are denying themselves of relationships and of love first, though. Number 7, sadness. A lack of bonding not only results in a lack of joy, but it produces a deep, deep sadness, like crying yourself to sleep at night, agonizing sadness. Joy comes through connections and relationships. When we are isolated from God and others, it's impossible to feel joy. The next one, number 8, fears of intimacy. We naturally fear what we don't know. People who have never had close relationships with other people will fear intimacy and avoid closeness to others. This one's one of those where if you are afraid of first impressions or just bringing yourself out there to get to know somebody, you might have this. Number 9, feelings of unreality. Some people are so detached that they literally feel completely disconnected from the world around them. They can see and hear people, but they just can't feel them. They think everything seems unreal. They may ask themselves, am I really here? These people answer this question by pinching themselves or cutting themselves to confirm they're alive and that what they're experiencing is real. Feelings of unreality are actually very common, but if a person doesn't understand them, they can be very scary. It's literally fighting to look at a world around them that doesn't seem real to them. Number 10, panic. I fall in this category too. Panic is a sudden, overpowering fright. Many panic attacks have lack of bonding at its root. If I'd have known that, it'd probably save me years of therapy, just saying. The human soul must be connected to others and filled with love. Some people feel like they are actually in a black hole. When people get too close to being completely isolated, they panic. It's the most terrifying experience known to humans. Okay, number 11, rage. This is a symptom, another symptom of isolation that's greatly demonstrated by uncontrolled outbursts of anger. Most must take a hard look for the lonely places deep within themselves, because when they feel loved and accepted, their rage will diminish. What they feel inside is much like an infant that's left alone and expresses pure, unadulterated rage. These anger outbursts are a natural protest against isolation. So grade yourself on that now. Okay, and then number 12, excessive caretaking. The only way some people feel close to others is to be taking care of them. They don't usually view caretakers, we don't usually view caretakers as someone that needs to be taken care of, because most caretakers seem really strong. However, underneath many caretakers' masks is a desperate need for relationship. Part of being a real self, we need to let people know that we have needs too. If you are always giving and never receiving, you're denying a part of your personal self that needs to be met. So excessive caretaking may be a symptom of an inability to bond with others. The last one, number 13, fantasy. Fantasy is a process of creating an unrealistic or ideal mental image in response to a psychological need, which is attachment. For example, people who are unable to make friends create imaginary ones. Isolated people do not experience the real thing, so they mentally escape into a safe, ideal relationship with a fantasy, but it never fulfills because only real relationships fulfill. Fantasy friends only further isolation. Real connections cure it. If you're one of those kind of people that excessively indulge in romance novels or porn, you might fall into that category. Were you able to see the commonality in all 13 issues? They are all cured by bonded, trusted, loving relationships. We just have to open up to finding new friends or gaining deeper relationships with our existing ones. When we experience any of these 13 symptoms, we may think we need to run to a doctor and get a prescription to fix our mental turmoils, but when most likely it would just be numbing the very basic need we're looking for in the first place, which is connections. So, this makes perfect sense to me, because when I was in counseling, I bonded with my therapist, and of course I was being very vulnerable and honest about my life. Why is this so hard for us to do with one another instead of paying someone to do it? So let's jump into the second section of this, which is those barriers that keep us from doing it. So we already identified now what maybe the deeper root of our problem is, but now we got to find out what's keeping us from the cure in it. If bonding to others can cure all these awful emotional things, then why don't we just do it? Well, if it was just that easy, I think all of us would be well. The reason we don't is because of the fall. And we have to realize, Satan he plays havoc on our lives. He just does crazy things that comes in, and, we get victimized, and, he influences us to do some things. We're in a fallen state. So we have all these problems, and we actually keep ourselves isolated in those problems, unable to attach to God and each other. And they call this barriers. The one thing we first have to admit is that we're all very needy people, every one of us. And that's a good thing, because this is where God and others meet us, and it helps our hearts. But we have to be humble enough to receive that kind of love and be filled with it. Jesus said in Matthew 3, one of my favorite verses, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." You know what the poor in spirit is? It's people like you and I who express their neediness to God and others. For theirs is the kingdom of God, is the other part to that verse. That means that we get to inherit all these wonderful things from the kingdom of heaven right here on earth. So let's talk about the barriers that's keeping us from those kind of blessings. The first one would be past injury. And of course, we all can probably relate to that to some degree. So let's do an example of that called the trust muscle.
Now, when Dr. Cloud was in graduate school, some members of his class found a 4-month-old German Shepherd puppy wandering in the road. The puppy was suffering from dehydration and malnutrition. The puppy also had bruises all over its body. So they took it home to care for it. Now, the puppy avoided them for the first month. Whenever they came near, it would shrink and tremble. When they tried to reach out their hands to pet it, it would cower in the corner. It had learned to expect abuse from the hands of humans. It feared the world it had come to know. This is the same way with children. We come into the world, we are totally dependent on our parents or caretakers. They are the ones who feed us when we're hungry, change us when we're wet, and comfort us when we're frightened. We develop our perception of the world and how trustworthy it is by our first caretakers who cared for us. We love because our parents first loved us. And we love God because He first loved us. If we are blessed with loving caretakers who meet our needs, we develop a trust muscle. We begin to perceive the world as a trustworthy place. In developmental terms, it's called basic trust. But if our needs are not met, if we are neglected or abandoned, beaten, abused, criticized, hated, or resented for even existing, then our very ability to trust and be vulnerable is injured. Our ability to bond is based on our ability to be vulnerable and needy. We are in trouble if this ability is damaged because it is the key to our life.
That's the key to your life, is being able to open up and be trusting. So what did your parents teach you about this world? Is it a trusting place or is it an oppressive place? And then about God, can you trust Him? And I would like to add even one more thing. If you're a parent right now, think about what you're teaching your children about this world and God, because it has lasting results. So we have two stances in this. First, you've been raised in a very trusting environment where you know that if you're doing, you're in this with all kinds of good, loving things and you feel comfortable being vulnerable and you'll get more and more love in being in that place. Or you've got the other stance where you've been raised in an untrusting environment where you think it's dumb to be vulnerable and you kind of survive on your instincts and say things like, I don't need anybody. I don't want anybody in my life, which is kind of smart if you're in an untrusting environment to begin with. So let's think about this though. God actually gave you a memory to satisfy certain elements of your life. And this is where our hope comes from, because remembering those good things that happened in our past, we're hoping that those good things will come back into our life again by repeating the same behaviors. This memory works the same though with the bad. We remember the bad and we kind of do the exact opposite. We try very hard to avoid what could be bad. So we draw these mental maps sometimes in our head and sometimes to maneuver life, but those aren't always healthy ones. But it's not something we really sit down and think about. It's just an automatic response, like not to touch a hot stove or anything. But as we get older and these constructed maps we put in our head don't work anymore with the new people and new changes in environments and different seasons of our life. So they may have worked in the past, but they will not work. They're outdated and they will not work for your future. But since we don't have some of the knowledge or experience to react in any other way, we tend to use them to find our way through life. So that's why you might get stuck in certain situations in your life. It's because you're using old coping mechanisms. So let's talk about what those coping mechanisms look like sometimes in our brain. And this is going to be about our self-talk. We sometimes distort some of our self-talk. And it's in 3 different sections. Again, give yourself a percentage on each one of these. These are much shorter than the ones I explained earlier, but we're going to start with our view of ourselves. Our view of ourselves. Please journal your answers after each one of these. The first one is, I am bad. We may feel bad about ourselves when we stay away from others. So grade yourself on that one. I am unlovable. We may feel unworthy of love of others. Grade yourself on that one. Something about me scares people away. We may feel like we're faulty or damaged in some way. Grade yourself on that. My sins are worse than other people's sins. We may feel like we're way worse off than anyone else. Grade yourself on that. I don't deserve love. We think we have to somehow earn love from other people when it's a free gift and from God. So grade yourself on that. My neediness will overwhelm anyone. We think our needs will ruin our relationships. My need for others is not valid. We may try to convince ourselves we shouldn't need relationships. The next one, my feelings will overwhelm anyone. We think we will be a problem in the relationship. Okay, we're going into the next part, which is our view of others. And this one is, no one is trustworthy. We won't give our vulnerable hearts to anyone in fear they'll misuse it. I think that's a common one. Number 2, people will always leave me. When we experience abandonment, we think others will do it again. The next one, people are mean and critical. If people have been abusive or critical in your neediness, it is unlikely that you'll be willing to open up yourself again. People will disapprove of me. That is your fear of judgment. People will control me. We give up bonding with people because we're afraid to give up we think that we're going to have to give up freedom, and because we fear controlling people. The last one is people are faking their care. We may feel like we are a burden to others, and that they may feel obligated to help us in our time of need. And so we just kind of blow it off like they're just faking their care. They really don't want to do this. They just feel obligated. Okay, the next view is our view of God. Same way, just score yourself on these. God doesn't really love me. People that feel unloved by people generally feel unloved by God. The next one, God doesn't care about the way I feel. He just wants me to be good. People that feel neglected by others feel neglected by God. God wants just good Christians. They feel left out by God because they have been left out by people. God gets angry with me. People have been angry and hurtful to them, so they expect God to be angry and hurtful to them too, and they don't feel like they can trust him. God doesn't hear me. When people don't see God or sense his presence, they tend to think he's not listening either. God doesn't answer prayer. God uses people to answer prayer. And if people are isolating themselves, they don't see the opportunities to get answered prayer, or they don't see the immediate answer to prayer that they'd like to see about something they're praying about. God will control me and take away my freedom. People fear God controlling them because they experience people controlling them. I feel like that a lot of the, I was raised in a Catholic church, and I thought I would have to give up a lot of freedoms, personal freedoms, just in order to practice faith. And God doesn't work like that. But if you feel that way, please write that down. God won't forgive me for whatever sin you have. Isolated people often believe God deserted them and that they're going to hell. They think that they've done the unpardonable sin, and they don't feel and know God's forgiveness. By the way, there's only one unpardonable sin, and that's to reject Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit, which lives within us. Okay, so you have a question here. After considering all these explanations of these distorted ways of thinking, do you feel a sense of hope that these are just born out of isolation and bad experience? And you do have the power to change your perspective just by updating your thinking. But this is not a real easy task, though. We're speaking about an overall condition of your heart. We form our view of relationships way before our frontal lobe is developed and before we even have the capacity to reason in our minds. We're just young people and we don't know. So there's one really important thing that, and you might write it down, is no real or deep change occurs outside of a relationship that's trusting, because that is the place where your heart lives. When we become vulnerable with one another, we learn new trust. We learn new ways to love, and we learn new rules of living in our hearts. We kind of change our old ways of thinking. All that distorted stuff goes out the window. So if God is giving you new opportunities for relationships, then it's best for you to face all those distorted ways of thinking and just take the risk. Take the risk of getting to know others in a real relationship. Now, you may need to humble yourself a little bit in this one, and I know that God has shown me over the years that none of us are as humble as He would all like us to be, but God promises that in that interaction that you're having with others and with Him, that He's going to help us with that task. David prayed in Psalm 139, 23 to 24. It says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in your way everlasting." So your question here is there anyone in your life right now that's offering you a connected, loving, trusting relationship? And what is holding you back from entering into it? And the last part of this study is we also have, and I hate to say this, but this is so true in all of us, and there's only a few of these, so hang tough with me, I'm almost finished here, they're called defense mechanisms. And we all kind of know we have them, but they hinder us. In addition to everything else we've already discussed, we have that barrier. But we need an explanation of what that looks like, so it's called our coats.
It makes sense to put on a warm coat to protect yourself against the bitter cold in the winter. But when summer comes, it also makes sense to take that coat off and enjoy the warm sunshine. We often wear psychological coats to protect us from injury. When God transports us to a warm land with possibilities of warm relationships, a heavy coat will cause problems instead of solving them. We don't need them anymore. God promises to give us new relationships in His family, but we have to work at taking off our coats in order to enjoy the newfound warmth. Different people have different types of coats to protect them against bonding.
Okay, so we're going to talk about our coats. So our first coat is denial. This is when we avoid confronting a personal problem by denying that it even exists. Denying our need for others, for example. If we don't have good, safe, solid relationships when we were young, then we likely taught ourselves that we don't need them. And because if you can't make them work, then why have them, right? So you slowly get rid of the awareness of your need for a relationship. But notice you didn't stop the need. You just stopped being aware of the need. But the need still exists because God literally created you to need relationships with Him and others. So basically all you've done is turn a deaf ear to your heart's cry for connection. And we're going to talk about that on a case study of the attorney.
Now, Dr. Cloud will never forget the attorney who was admitted into the hospital program for a depression and angry outbursts. The second day he was there, he said, "What's all this stuff about needs? I don't need anyone." Slowly, however, as the weeks went by, we noticed that anytime his group would talk about loneliness, he would go and demand a tranquilizer. Much later, he began to realize that these discussions were difficult for him because they got him closer to experiencing his long forgotten need for others. As he slowly gave up denying this long forgotten need for a relationship, he began to connect with others. He discovered that macho needs love too.
Macho needs love too. So if you have to run it to get a tranquilizer when people start getting close to you, you might have this. So denial is that one. Devaluation is your second code. When we devalue available love, and that looks like this. Love presents itself, and we devalue its importance by saying something like, you don't really care about me. We somehow change what is positive into negative. This is a horrible thing because we're pushing away the very thing that we need the most. And we have a little bit of a case study on the poisonous state.
Well, it would be like staying in isolation when love is plainly staring us in the face. It would be as if we were starving to death, and then someone gave us a steak. We would say, it's probably poisoned. Because of our devaluation, we remain in that starving state. Never able to get food, we remain in isolation because the risks of love are too great.
So, if any time that somebody offers you the goodness of a relationship and you are making it seem like, writing it off like it's not a good thing in any way, you might have this. Projection is your next code. Projection is when I give other people credit for my feelings, my attitudes, and ideas. We sometimes project our needs on others instead of owning them for ourselves. Caretakers can fall into this category because they tend to give what they need for themselves. We have to be careful not to project our needs onto others because then our needs don't get met. It's often like you may even say, my children need when you need. My husband needs when you need. It can go the other way too, the blaming thing. It's other people's fault, not mine. So that one is the one that you kind of need to watch for is projection. The next code is reaction formation. This is when you express a feeling that is an exact opposite of what you truly feel. Simply put, I'm going to ask for the opposite of what I really want. For example, when people are truly lonely, they become extremely independent and preach against dependency or neediness. They deny themselves the very opposite of what they need. So it's denying that there's a part of you that needs something, so you're just going to do the opposite anyway. The fifth code, I fell on this one, is mania. I know that sounds crazy, but listen to the explanation. Mania is extreme excitement that shows itself in hyperactivity, disorganization, and elevation of our moods. Basically, if they stay busy enough, they will not need anybody. And workaholics fall in this category, by the way. The sixth code, idealization. Idealization is searching for something that is perfect, but it's not real. Fantasy can fall in this category. People that have trouble falling in love or staying in love sometimes suffer from this. They are constantly on the search for an ideal person to meet all their needs perfectly. No one's perfect. It's never going to happen. It's idealization. The seventh code and the final code is substitution. This is simply substituting one person or thing for another. When people can't get real relationship, they substitute something else in its place. Addictions fall in this category. They substitute drugs, alcohol, food in the place of love of God and others. Telling someone to stop that kind of behavior is a good idea, but unless you're meeting that need for them, the behavior will return. This person needs a super amount, a super fill in their soul of God and others. Okay, so those are your codes. Now, I had you grade all of these on a 0 to 100%. So I'd like you to go back now, and all of the things that you graded yourself on, anything that's 50% or higher, put a little star next to it. Okay, so then our weekly challenge in this is to devise a statement of who you truly are, the results of the fall on your life, the results of everything that's happened in your life are the exact things that we talked about tonight. It's really being very authentic, very vulnerable, and very true to who you really are, all these different test results. Write it out as a statement. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. Then pray over it and ask God to reveal to you more fully what you've learned tonight about yourself in this study. When I did mine, I am Teresa, I'm a sinner. And that's something we talked about in the beginning of the study. And these are the things that the effects of the fall did to my life. On the 13 symptoms of bonding, I have feelings of badness or guilt. I have issues with addiction, coping mechanisms. I have a panic disorder from it, and I'm excessive in my caretaking. I view myself sometimes as bad or unlovable. Sometimes some things about me I feel like scare people away. My sins sometimes feel worse than others. My view of others is that people will always leave me at some point. People are mean and critical sometimes, and people will disapprove of me. My view of God is that I am so humbled by the forgiveness He's given me for my sins that sometimes it can overwhelm me with grief. And my codes that I wear are projection, mania, and substitution. And I ask you to pray for me that the Lord comes in with grace and time and truth and helps me to overcome all of these. This is a vulnerable statement of who you are. And this is about being able to own the things that this world has produced in you. But it doesn't mean that's a place that we're going to need to stay. Through this study, we're going to learn how we can take those percentages and put them in a more healthy place. We didn't finish this entire chapter. We're going to add it to next week's chapter. But we'll be learning more about God's ways, and we'll be learning more how to bond with others. I thank you, Lord, that you came into this study tonight and helped us through this time. And I pray that this is a blessing towards the people that have heard it and are receiving it. If you have any prayer requests, please feel free to post them in our chat. And God bless you all. And thank you for joining us tonight from Terry's home, my home, to yours. Thank you and have a great night.